Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 16. This is our last episode of 2018, so have a Happy New Year, and the next time I'll see you is in 2019. Since we're after the holidays, I have an update about what's happening here at Fun Ideas Productions. Final edits are still being done on my Warren Kremer and Alvin Show books. I still don't have an official release date yet for either, but you can order the Alvin Show book now at bearmanormedia.com. I am hoping for a February release date, and I'll let you know in an upcoming podcast. Today's guest is David Seidman. He had lengthy tenures at Disney Comics, as well as Claypool Comics and Marvel and DC. He has also written a diverse library of books, and we'll discuss all these things today. Here he is, David Seidman. So, hello David, how are you doing today?
I'm all right, Mark. How are you?
Good. You have had a very vast career, according to what you've told me, shown me, what I've searched around on the internet. So, I guess, how did you get started in the comic book world? What was your interest, and how did you land such lucrative roles as being editor and founder of different comic publishers and things like that? So, I guess start from the beginning.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm editor and founder of publishers, but I've worked for various companies.
Okay.
I was always a comics fan, and when I went to college, actually, as an English major, I was starting to think as I hit my senior year, well, I'm going to have to make a living. What am I going to do? And eventually I settled on publishing, and I started submitting pieces to the comics press. I had a book review in the Comics Journal. I wrote an article for Amazing Heroes, which was the Comics Journal sister publication focusing on superheroes. And I got into journalism as eventually a comic strip editor at the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, which did strips based on, among other things, Star Trek and Star Wars. Well, how I got into comic books was our art director at the LA Times Syndicate, Lee Nordling, who has had quite a pop culture career himself, went to Disney. And he called me a while later, knowing that I wanted to leave the LA Times, and said, there's a job here that I think would be good for you. I applied, I got it. Among the things that the job involved was editing the stories that went into Disney Comics worldwide. Mm-hmm. And when Disney started its own comic book company in the late 1980s, I was one of the natural choices to help develop the line and then become one of the editors of the line. From there, I was in comic books, okay. And I've been. So that's how I got in.
I guess that's why I said founder, because and if it's an incorrect term, I did read that you're a co-founder of Disney Comics. So
yeah, co-founder.
Okay.
It was originally a cartoonist and editor named Bob Foster, who has quite a career in animation and other fields. Mm-hmm. And me, we were on staff in this part of Disney called Creative Services, which basically oversaw all of Disney publishing in the United States and Canada, I believe, including the comics that were being produced for the overseas market. And so Bob and I were the original two people involved on the editorial side. We brought in Len Wein, who was hired as the editor-in-chief. We basically helped our boss get hired, which is a nice deal, I must say. And, Len was, for those who don't know, a very important comics editor and writer, primarily known for co-creating Swamp Thing and co-creating Wolverine. And we knew him because the comics business was, at that point, pretty small. We knew Len. He was local to L.A., which a lot of comics people were not. We knew that he knew Disney. He had a good sense of humor. He also understood things like story construction and working with artists. So the three of us, basically on the editorial side, created Disney Comics. There were people on the other side, the publishing side, the business side, who were there as well.
Mm-hmm.
But on the editorial side, it was me and Bob, and then Len, and then others.
Now, did you work at all when Disney was with Gladstone prior to that, or is that when you?
Well, that was part of my gig, because before, as part of the team that was overseeing all of the U.S. publishing, I was dealing with, and as a comics guy on that team, the comics editor on that team, I was the one who worked with Gladstone. They submitted their stories and art through us,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought I thought they were doing great work,
Yes.
but they weren't ready to do the kind of expansion we wanted to do, the very large amount of new comics we wanted to do, and the company wanted to take them in-house anyway, and it hurt, because I knew the Gladstone people, I liked them,
Yeah.
And they were doing good work, and I don't think I was the one who told them, no, it's all coming back within Disney.
Mm-hmm.
But it was. I mean, I ended up hiring some of them as writers and colorists and people like that.
Yeah.
But it was. You don't like telling somebody who's been doing nothing but a good job, nope, sorry, can't use you anymore.
Right.
Yeah, it sucked. It did.
Now, the person who really, I get what I've heard, and I lived through all this, and I was reading the books then, so I kind of have a good knowledge of it. It was Michael Eisner himself that wanted to bring it in-house. He was trying to get everything under Disney's control rather than licensing things. Is that correct, or?
I really don't know. I never heard about I don't think, it's been a long time. I don't think I heard about Eisner making that decision himself. Yes, he did want, as far as I know, to get as much as possible in-house, just as a general decision. But I don't think he said specific. Well, I don't know.
Okay. I
never heard that he said specifically bring the comic books in, because we were so tiny compared to the parks and the movies and TV and all of these things.
Right. But I know one thing that happened at that time is they purchased Gibson greeting cards, and part of that was so they didn't have to license out to Hallmark and everything else, at least at that time. I think now they license out everything again, but that was Eisner's thinking to get it all under his control.
That may have been. I never dealt with people on Eisner's level or anywhere near it.
Okay, so you never met with him. That was just kind of a question.
God, no. I was never near him. The closest I got when there would be sort of they would have these annual meetings of the entire studio staff,
mm-hmm.
Which included us, and Eisner would give a talk. So I was like in the 98th row, but I was in the same room. That's about as close as I got.
Now, how long did the Disney Comics imprint last? It seemed to me it was about 5 years. Is that correct? Am I thinking correctly?
Roughly speaking. Okay. I mean, it was about, I think it was a little bit less than that.
Okay, because I remember the infamous Disney implosion. But prior to that, it seemed like you were doing pretty well. It was like you were doing titles for each of the Disney afternoon shows. So there was a Chip and Dale title, and there was a, what are those shows? I can't even think of all. But,
oh, boy. There was DuckTales. There was Tailspin.
Yeah, Tailspin. That's what I was thinking. It was DuckTales.
I was editing Chip and Dale. We did Darkwing Duck. I worked on that.
Mm-hmm.
We did a lot of things. Yeah, we were doing live graphic novel adaptations of some of the live action movies. There weren't even Disney movies. They would be from other parts of the company, like Touchstone or Hollywood Pictures. Right. I edited, for example, an adaptation of the horror comedy Arachnophobia.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
With John Goodman.
Yes, with John Goodman. So yeah, we were doing. We had a big sandbox to play in, and we had a great time.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were doing those, were those? because I know how Disney is like this, but were you doing things exclusively for the U.S. market, or was it like kind of how Egmont evolved, where, you know, it starts off in the European markets and then eventually gets translated into the American market or whatever? How were you doing it?
The way it ran back then is that every publisher would do things for their own market, and then they would be available for every other Disney publisher to reprint if they wanted to. I mean, we certainly picked up things from the foreign publishers because some of the work was just so good.
Yeah.
And they picked up stuff from us. Matter of fact, Marv Wolfman, who was one of our editors and writers, and of course is known for his work at DC and Marvel.
Yeah.
We had a book that I launched called Goofy Adventures, and the idea of that was you would have Goofy as famous people throughout history, but he was still, you know, Goofy, God bless him. So we had Goofy, you know, as Goofy George Washington. We had Goofy Frankenstein. We had, you know, so it was both fiction and nonfiction, as long as it was historical.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Marv, of course, got famous for, among other things, Tomb of Dracula, which he did with Gene Colan and Tom Palmer.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually leading up to the foreign publisher, really. And Marv wrote this story, and we got Gene Colan and Tom Palmer to draw it. So, yes, Gene Colan drew Goofy, God help us. And it was great, by the way. It was terrific.
Yeah.
But Marv, and it got published overseas. I showed him a copy of the French magazine Journal de Mickey with that story, and Marv looked at it and said, "But the story's all puns. How did they translate it?" I said, "No, Marv, I don't speak French." And yeah, we were under sort of a rule. I told my writers, I assume the other editors did as well, try to avoid word gags, because this is going to have to be translated. But yeah, the stuff went everywhere.
The one I remember, I think, but I don't think you did this. I think you got it from Europe. Is there was a Goofy James Bond parody? That's the one I.
Yes. Oh boy, that was the only thing I did with that. I was selected and have it translated and rewritten to American idioms. But yeah, we picked that up from. We even picked up the cover of the book from Europe with Goofy, instead of holding the James Bond gun by the side of his face, was holding a little pop gun.
Right. Now, I'm friends with Dana Gabbard, who used to publish Duckburg Times. I think you're friends with him too, and he recommended you, among other things, to talk on this podcast. Now, I used to be in this thing called an APA, which they don't even do anymore, thanks to the internet and blogs and everything. But
nobody needs it.
And for those who don't know, it's Amateur Press Association, where everybody writes a little bit of story or article or something, and then makes enough copies for everybody in the group, and then the entire giant book is distributed to everyone periodically. So that's essentially what an APA is.
And a lot of really good talent came out of those things.
Yes. So I was with one called Where the Fun Begins, or WTFB, for a number of years. And the commentary was mainly on the Disney Afternoon, but everybody had their little, areas of interest, and a number of people really liked the comic books, which I'll talk about again in a second. I was kind of more into like the theme parks and Disney animation, and others liked to write Disney fiction, where they'd write their own. I did a couple of those too. I did this one called Horace Horsecollar's Dilemma with Mickey Mouse, and just to see if I could write a piece of fiction. And everybody thought that was really funny, but they all said, "Yeah, Disney would never do this." Even though I kept it in character, it just still was like a little far afield. They might do it nowadays because Disney is a little more adventurous that way, but certainly not in the late 80s, early 90s. But anyway, the big thing that happened, and since I was reading the comic books but not, digesting them, where I was, like paying attention every month, I would just, when they came out, I'd buy them, is that Disney implosion. So what actually caused that, and what was it? I mean, it's like, it seemed like you're publishing like about 10 titles regularly, monthly, and then just suddenly boom, it dropped to like Walt Disney Comics and Stories and Uncle Scrooge, and that was all she wrote. And then it went back to Gemstone or Gladstone or which one it was at that point, and that was all she wrote. So what caused that?
I don't know, because that was a business decision, and as I said, I wasn't on the business side. Basically, what I think happened was that the company, it was not a cheap proposition. You have all these people on staff. It wasn't a huge staff, but there were 3 or 4 editors, there were production people, plus we were paying for freelancers to, write and draw the books. And it was not earning the kind of money that the company wanted it to earn, which is the reason for almost any business decision, really.
Right.
Then there were certain other things that limited the amount of money we could make. For example, Marvel or DC, they've got these superheroes, they can license them out to movies and whatnot. Well, we were, in a sense, an in-house licensee. Anything we created was already based on the Disney world, so it's not like we could take Disney Comics and say, go to a greeting card company or a toy maker and say, here you go, there's buy the license for this. No, because those licenses already existed, and it was not part of our assignment to create all kinds of new characters. Our assignment was to take the existing characters. So we were cut off from a stream of income that other sizable comics companies didn't have. That they had. We didn't have it, they did. That was part of it. Plus newsstand. Plus, I think there was a strategic error in that we went for the comic shop market, which was great. It was basically ready cash because it was so simple. The distributors or retailers would buy the books, we get the money, done. Whereas newsstand distribution, which was declining in any event,
right.
Newsstand was much harder. Newsstand was you send the books out, you wait, you accept the returns, you get the money for what did sell, but it was always a gamble. And since the internet did not exist on the scale that it is today, certainly, we couldn't go digital. There were just a limited number of income streams that we could get from the books, and the sales were not. We sold very well on some of these things. We were selling. I'll tell you another story. Peter David, who wrote for me, who wrote The Little Mermaid 4-issue miniseries we did. Well, Peter helped me get a job or a freelance gig at this company called Full Moon Entertainment, which made direct-to-video movies. They wanted to start up a publishing house. Peter was writing movies for them. The head of the studio, Charlie Band, said, Peter, publishing, who can we get for the publishing? And he recommended me. God love you, Peter. I'm not being sarcastic. I thought that it was great.
Yeah.
Well, so I came in, and because business people and studio heads like to know numbers, I showed them sales figures for things like the Little Mermaid series. And Peter looked at those numbers, which were in well over 100,000 copies, and he said, damn, I should have asked for more money. And so, some of the books were selling very well. Some were not. That's just the way a company is. But overall, the money coming in was not enough, and the company, I think that if we had been allowed to keep going for a while, we could have made a profit and we've done a nice little business for Disney. There's no way to know.
Yeah.
But that was it. The company was not given long and okay. Again, I have to back up. I come out of journalism initially, and newspaper and magazine publishing. My first job in publishing, I was as an intern at Los Angeles Magazine, which is one of the bigger city magazines. And I knew that in periodical publishing, magazine publishing, it takes 5 years to break even, let alone make a profit.
Right.
Sports Illustrated took quite a long time. The the most enormous success in recent decades at the time, then recent, was People magazine. Huge hit, and it took a year and a half to get to just to break even.
Yeah.
And so if People couldn't do it in a year and a half, well, the Disney business people were looking at us within 2-3 years and saying, well, you guys aren't making a profit yet. And my feeling was, look, give us 5. Yeah. Give us a standard 5. Mm-hmm. Well, that didn't happen. As a business decision, when you look at just the straight numbers, I would agree with them on the straight numbers. Mm-hmm. But if you look at it in the wider context, I don't know. Plus, the other side of it was, and again, as a business decision, I think this makes huge sense. Their attitude was, wait a minute, why are we spending all this money on salaries, on equipment, rent, freelancing, all of this stuff, plus the various headaches that come with publishing, because even an innocuous business like Disney Comics, mm-hmm. you never know. There could always be a problem, mm-hmm. Especially you're aiming at kids. That can be very delicate. Why are we going through this, spending all this money, when we've got Gladstone, Gemstone, whatever you want to call, sitting out there willing to pay us money to take all these burdens off our shoulders? It's, as a business decision, it makes absolute perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, like I said, I don't know for sure about what I said earlier about Michael Eisner, but maybe that was his thinking to bring it under the same roof, but then, he or somebody else realized that it was more lucrative to keep it licensed out, so...
Well, this happens I work for a number of companies. This happens a lot, where a company will say, let's set up our own little division for this, see how it goes. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't work, we'll cancel it. Well, from their standpoint, and from the standpoint of the numbers, absolutely, it didn't work.
Yeah. Now, were the accountants or the bean counters, or whatever you want to call them, were they kind of looking at, wow, these comics, when they're published by Dell, sold in the millions, and you're not selling? Did they act like that? Like different? No, go ahead.
Here's the accounting side of it. And by the way, people blame the accountants. People call them bean counters. The accountants save our asses. They make sure our people got paid. Okay. God bless the accountants. Okay. The accountants don't make decisions. The most they do is make recommendations. Okay. Disney Comics, I should have mentioned this earlier, but we're talking about memories that go back a long way. Remember I told you when I was editing the comics that we created in-house, mm-hmm. so that all of the foreign publishers would have enough stuff to put into their books. Some foreign publishers generated a lot of their own, some did not, but in any event, we were creating a lot of material so that all of the foreign publishers and the domestic, the U.S. publishers could have material to publish. It was a service we did for them. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they paid for it or how much, I really don't know. But they did. But we created all of this stuff, and the idea was, wait a minute, why are we creating this stuff that goes overseas? Why don't we create we're paying to create comics anyway. Why don't we publish them ourselves? And so, that was a lot of what went into it as well on the business side.
Right.
That part because the executives a couple executives told me that.
Right. That
they were looking strictly at the numbers. It's like, we're paying for this stuff anyway. Mm-hmm. Why not publish it?
Right.
And then we editors got ambitious and said, well, if we're going to set up a comics publishing house, there are a lot of other things we can and should do. Mm-hmm. And so we did.
Now, during this same time, there was the issue with the speculator market where they're buying multiple copies of Spider-Man and things like that, and different comic store owners would hoard issues in their basements, hoping to sell them off for millions of dollars a month later, and the whole thing imploded that way. Did that have any effect on the Disney thing, or it just happened to be a coincidence that in the early 90s all this was kind of happening at the same time?
I really am not sure. We didn't. If we benefited from it, we probably did a little bit. It wasn't anything near like what Marvel benefited from with Spider-Man #1, which came out around our time, or the new X-Men books, which came out around that time, or Image. Mm-hmm. We were definitely in the middle of all of that. The first Image issues. I do know that our first issues sold very well, and maybe that's the speculator market. Maybe that's just regular readers being intrigued. I don't think the speculator market affected us that much. I kind of wish they had, because we would have sold more books.
Okay. Well, I'm just kind of curious because I'm thinking about that time and everything like that. So moving on from that, did you stay with Disney after that, or were you done after the whole thing imploded?
Well, after it imploded, they put me on a freelance contract for, I believe, 6 months, so that I could help with basically the wrapping up. And I came in one or 2 days a week, or as needed, because even after you announce, you still have to put out the final books.
Right.
And so they would call me in from time to time. Plus, I would do other services for example, Disney Adventures magazine, which was a digest-sized magazine, and that was put in at the supermarket checkout stands, things like that. Mm-hmm. Took the place of a lot of the Archie books, and I'm told the Archie management was not happy about it. We bought the space.
Yes.
Disney Adventures published a variety of stuff. I wrote a couple articles for them. I believe it was under my contract. I did some consulting. Mm-hmm. Some talent scouting, I should say, because the division I was in, before Disney Comics, Creative Services, they were having a very hard time, as most people in any company do, finding good talent. And so they were trying to build up a pool of freelance talent that they could bring in, artists in particular, who they could bring in, who knew how to draw Disney characters and understood the styles. And so I did some talent scouting for them and found some people. But at the end of that contract, I was gone, but I continued to do as much Disney work as I could because, I was unemployed. I needed to make a living. So I wrote for the Disney Channel at the time, and it may still. It at the time had a magazine, and I wrote an article or two for there. There was a Disney magazine that was more general for Disney fans, and I had a great time for the Disney Channel magazine. I wrote about the writing of the original Rescuers and Beauty and the Beast, and interviewed the people involved with that, which was a great pleasure. I have to tell you, one of my basic lines about Disney is that the writers, the artists, the creative people in general I work with there, I would work with again, anytime, any project. They are just, anything you want to say good about them, I will agree with, because the writers and artists and other creative people, talented, helpful, prompt, reliable, some criticism, whatever it was you want to say about them, I will agree. And I know I'm sounding like a shill for the company, which, I am not. But I'm talking about just the creative people, just about the best talent I've worked with anywhere, and I'd work with them again in a heartbeat. And whenever I got the chance, I did. Mm-hmm. Which wasn't often, but I did. But anyway, so I left the company, or the company laid me off. Laid me off, put me under contract, and then after the contract, I continued freelancing simply because it's what I knew, and I had to make a living.
And you could.
I even did things like writing and editing for the Disney company, the corporate annual report.
Oh, wow.
So, because wherever the work is, as long as somebody has, words on a page and a paycheck, I want it to be first in line.
Right. So I didn't get the Disney Channel magazine, but you mentioned the Disney magazine. I used to get that. It was the old Disney News. Did you do a lot of work for that publication, or
not a lot?
Okay.
I wrote one cover story on Disney television when Home Improvement and other shows produced by Disney were very, very big. But no, I didn't do. I wish I had done more. I was open to it, but their schedules and mine didn't continue to mesh.
Right. Okay. And let's see. So I'm going to ask a weird question just because your name is David Seidman. You told me how to pronounce it. Thank you. And but in doing research on finding out things that you've done, I found out there was another David Seidman who is an artist. So, I mean, do you get commonly confused for that, and what happens with that?
Not usually, no.
Okay.
I mean, he's a hell of a good artist. Boy, I wish I were. Like that. Occasionally, I remember one point I got passes for, I believe it was Wizard World Philadelphia, which I had not even applied to be a guest or a pro at. And I thought, oh, God, all right, the Wizard World people, I was on their mailing list for various other things. They mixed me up with the other guy. Okay. And he and I are Facebook friends, and, we know of each other's existence.
Mm-hmm.
But, no, rarely, it used to have, we used to get confused more, but not so much for quite a while now.
Okay. Just as an aside, I don't know if you ever listen to Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, but
no, I know about it, but
but he was interviewing Tom Holland. Now, he mentioned this to his son, and his son was all excited because Tom Holland plays Spider-Man. Well, it wasn't.
Right.
It wasn't that Tom Holland. It was the Tom Holland who's the director. So. Suddenly he was disinterested. So if anybody's listening to this thinking they're getting the artist one, I apologize. Maybe I'll interview him separately in a different episode.
I'll tell you something else. There's another David Seidman, and I don't know how he pronounces it, who I've written a lot of books. He writes books as well. If you see my name on something and it's about ocean kayaking or wilderness navigation, that's the other guy. I'm the one who writes it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about because, I have my own Amazon page, and I suggest you do it too if you have this confusion. There are other Mark Arnolds out there, and but if I put it under my own name, then, I can connect to my own books, which are generally about comic books and animation and music. So when you get the one about financial planning or other Mark Arnold books that aren't me, I don't connect to those. So, but I see different books, and you can tell me if these are yours or not, I guess. So there's a book called Holiday Lights. Is that yours?
That's me.
Okay, so talk about that one a little bit.
Oh, my. Holiday Lights came about because Workman Publishing, which is a fairly sizable publisher of very interesting, entertaining books, bought this other company called Story Publishing. And when I first talked to people at Story, I said, really, your company is called Story? You do story books? And they said, yeah, we've heard that one. Anyway, so the head of Workman, Peter Workman, who has done, I believe, comics-related books as well, he said, I want a book about Christmas lights. Well, I was, as a freelancer always is, hunting for my next gig, and saw the kind of books. I'm not sure how I was reading the trade journals for the publishing industry, but anyway, I got in touch with Story. They knew I had done, and I told them, I've done pop culture stuff, and I proposed a couple ideas for them. And they said, look, these ideas are nice, but we really need somebody to write this Christmas lights book. Do you want to do it? I said, sure. Now, I'm Jewish. And that's one of the reasons why the book is called Holiday Lights, I think. So I wrote up a proposal for them, and they said, yeah, this is it. Good, go do it. And that was pretty much it, except that since it had to be out before Christmas, it had to be done very, very fast. I mean, I wrote that thing, which is something along the lines of 80,000 words, in about 2-3 months, which is very fast, at least for me. Mm-hmm. A lot of long nights. It was an enjoyable book. But wow, it was. Since I was was not an expert in it. I was starting from absolute scratch. I've never put up lights on my house, ever. So I was now going to have to become an expert on this.
So it's just basically the history of how,
well, not
since
just
the invention of the electric light, how lighting has kind of taken over during the holiday periods?
No.
Okay, I'm wrong. Okay,
that's part of it. That's part of the chapter.
Okay, good. Okay.
I did cover the history, but mostly it was a survey. I have to explain. Story publishing is primarily a how-to publisher.
Okay.
How to make a rock garden or botanical garden in your backyard, that kind of thing. I wanted to do it more as a coffee table book, but there is quite a lot of how-to in the book toward the back.
Got it. Okay.
And they knew I was not a how-to guy. I studied up and I did it. But I still am not clear on the difference between amps, volts, and watts, but never mind. Anyway, so it was great fun, even though it was, under high speed, because it's a fun subject to deal with. And I ended up, after it was done, doing a book tour in, I swear to you, a red satin jacket, black tuxedo pants, a black top hat that lit up, and a tie that lit up. I had a fine old time. But I got in touch with the lights community, and people would ask me, journalists, when the book came out, they'd ask, well, what are the controversies in the business? And I had to say, there really aren't any. The lights community, the biggest difference, and it's not even an argument, because it's very live and let live, is, well, do you do a lot of Santas and reindeer and stuff like that? Or are you strictly a Jesus is the reason for the season type of person, and you celebrate that? So I was a great disappointment to a lot of my brother and sister journalists. I'm sorry, guys. There are no lights business.
All the dirt is dished up in holiday lights.
There's just no dirt. When people do get jealous of each other, the way they take it out is they just put more lights on their own homes.
Yes, I've seen National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. So.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, the Griswold house.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to go through these books. If they're not yours, just say not mine. Okay, so the next book I saw is Brazil ABCs.
Yeah. That was... again, most of these are things I was just hired to do. I got in touch with publishers. I would say, I see you do books that are similar to the books I've done. You got anything coming up? And so there are a series of these country ABC books. And I wish I had wild stories about this one, but this was just a matter of, I sit down, I do the research, I write the book. It was difficult for some of the letters. It's always hard to find things for X,
Right.
But it was an ABC book with all of this stuff, and after it came out, I looked at it and I said, "Whoa! This looks great." And I got in touch with the artist, I wish we'd had a chance to talk before. Not that anything would have been different, but it's like, oh God, this is a guy who is going through the same things I am on the same project, and we really just said, oh yeah, that one, boy, where he said that one. I said, for example, boy, the drawing of the Jaguar for Jay. You really just knocked it out of the park on that. And he said, boy, am I glad you put J for Jaguar, because, I love drawing that kind of stuff. So, but no, not a lot of tales of adventure. I didn't go to Brazil. I do not speak Portuguese, none of that stuff.
Well, then why Brazil? Was it just, was it part of a series? Or?
That was the assignment they had.
Okay.
I think they may have given me a choice of 2 or 3 others in Brazil. I thought, well, Western Hemisphere, I understand that. Right. But no, it was just a straight out assignment, and I was a lot of fun doing it.
Okay.
But it was just a matter of, okay, now I'm going to learn this subject. That's a lot of the fun for me. It's, hey, I get to learn about this stuff, and I don't have to pay tuition. This is great.
Right.
They're paying me.
Yes, exactly. Let's see. The next book on here, I got All Gone Things That Aren't there, or something like that. Is that right?
All gone. Things that aren't there
There
anymore.
we go. I wrote it without the colon, so it's just all gone things that aren't there. Whoops.
Yeah, and it's great fun because there was I wrote this when the internet was even less reliable than it is now. So this was all library research, pretty much, as well as going around to a few old people I knew and saying, "What do you remember that's gone?" And it was again a job of great education. But a lot. Michael Ventura, terrific essayist, talks about. He wrote an article years ago. It's now, I think, published under the talent of the room. But when I read it in a newspaper, it was called "The Art of the Chair." And the art of the chair for him, was you create anything by planting your butt in the chair long enough and working at it. It's not a mystery. It's the talent is going into the room and doing it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these books are like that for me. I have an assignment. I'm a professional. I hope I have fun doing it, but by God, I'm going to plant my butt in the chair and not get up till it's done. And that's the way I enjoy the nostalgia book. I love history. I've written a lot of history and biography, and that fascinates me. But the nostalgia book, the All Gone book, one of the things that got me unexpectedly, I have no interest in sports whatsoever. But writing the chapter on things like stadiums or sports teams, I wrote a section for that about Ebbets Field and the Brooklyn Dodgers. Mm-hmm. And the quotes and stories that I was reading about players who played on the Dodgers and had a great sentiment and feeling for it and for Ebbets Field. One of these guys said something like, "Ebbets Field was wonderful. Even if you were the rawest, greenest rookie, it kept you from tripping over your own feet." And I thought, what a beautiful quote. I'm putting that in. And now where Ebbets Field was, and this is a kind of irony that if you put it in a book, in fiction, you'd say, "Oh, cool, so cornball." I'm not sure what it is. I think it's a parking lot or something, but it has, large flat walls, and there's a line saying, no ball playing here. Where Ebbets Field used to stand.
Wow. Now, how is this book set up? Is it just little items, like a list, and then you talk about, or is it really big subjects, or how do you have it?
It was everything. There were big subjects. One of the things that I said was not there anymore was the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. But having come out of newspaper and magazine journalism, writing a book was a new thing for me, or kind of new. I'd written a few, but nothing of this scale. And so I divided it into what I thought of as newspaper magazine articles, a few hundred words on each subject, and that worked out pretty well.
Okay. Let's see. The next book we have looks like a biography on Jerry Spinelli.
Jerry Spinelli, children's book author, won the what was it? The Newbery. I think it was the Newbery Award. I always get the Newbery and the Caldecott mixed up. I used to work in libraries too. I'm embarrassed.
One's for writing, one's for art, but yeah.
Well, Spinelli won for his book Maniac McGee, but he's written a lot of books for kids and young adults. And I was hired. The publisher was doing a series of books on young people's authors. I really wanted to do the book on Francesca Leah Bloch because of Weetzie Bat, because she wrote about L.A., where I've always lived. Mm-hmm. And, well, she was at the time young and attractive, and I thought, well, maybe if I get to know her, because I was single. But in any event, I got Jerry Spinelli, and he was a guy who, it was interesting, what I like to do, in whether I'm an editor or a writer, is look for what's not there, what's not explicit. And I noticed, for example, he wrote this one book for teenagers. One. It did not get very well received, and he's never written a book for teenagers again. Now, he talked about that. He's never said, "Oh, God, I left a bad taste in my mouth," or whatever. But I thought, oh, well, isn't that interesting? And I just kind of mentioned it. After this book, he never wrote another book for teenagers again. Dun, dun, dun. And so that was, I never spoke to him. I did an interview via mail, where I just submitted the questions. The publisher sent them to him. He answered them, but I did end up reading all of his books and liking them quite a bit. He's a really good writer, and honestly, I wish he would write stuff for grown-ups. I'd read him. He's really good.
So I assume, forgive me, I don't really know him that well. I guess
most adult stuff.
Yeah.
His best-known book, Maniac McGee.
Okay.
When I was writing about, I was talking to my sister-in-law and her family.
Okay.
Her daughter was there, and I said, I'm writing about Jerry Spinelli. And my sister-in-law, who's a school teacher, said to her daughter, "You know that one? He wrote Maniac McGee." And my niece's face lit up. Oh yeah. So, you got to be in the right crowd.
Right. But he's still around. He's still doing new books currently?
As far as I know, I have not kept in touch.
Okay. Because that was the main thing. I was just curious. Seeing that, and talking about it, I am still interested in children's books as best I can be, especially if they're well written. I always, whenever I go to the Barnes & Noble, remember that brick and mortar store? Anyway, I always go into the children's book section because I'm just kind of curious what's coming out, and I flip through graphic novels and various picture books just to kind of see what's going on. I don't necessarily buy them, but I don't always, to be honest, look at.
Buy the books.
I know. I do sometimes, but. Like anything Raina Telgemeier, however you pronounce her name, I hate to say, puts out, I buy, yes. So I like her stuff, so things like that. Yeah, it's funny how they lay out the store, because if I'm looking for something, I have to go through the humor section, then I have to go through the graphic novel section, and then I have to go through the children's section because it could be in any one of those three places something I'm looking for.
Exactly.
So I just make a big tour around the store and pick up something and buy something or put it back or look through it. But I don't always look at names, so that's why I was like curious of what Jerry had done. So I'll have to pay attention to him. So. The last two books I saw on the list, they're very similar, so I'll just mention them in tandem. Teens in South Africa, Teens in Iran?
Yes.
Iran?
And those were part of a series, and I did not travel to either of those places, but it was fascinating to read, to study up on them. Iran in particular, because one thing I did not know is that at the time, it may still be true, the biggest languages, as far as just number of people or traffic online, were something like English, Chinese, and always third or fourth was Farsi. Because the Iranians, this is no primitive country. These guys are hooked up. And that saved me, because a lot of these people, in order to write honestly but not get caught by the authorities, wrote in English. So there were these very surprisingly frank blogs out there by young people and folks who worked and knew young people, and it really helped tremendously. It also did not hurt very much. I didn't use this resource because I didn't have a lot of time, but Los Angeles has an enormous Iranian immigrant community. It is the nickname for LA is Tehrangeles. and in fact, a lot of people in Iran, there's a lot of television production in Farsi that goes to Iran, to the point where the authorities in Iran will sometimes do a sweep of houses to find hidden satellite dishes, because people are trying to get news from a free country. And they wanted it in Farsi. And that was LA. We have the Farsi speakers and the TV industry. But that was a fascinating book to dig into. For example, I found that although, yes, it is a very devoutly Iranian country and very heavily, it's a police state. It's very heavily policed. The most popular music for young people is heavy metal. They love Metallica in Iran.
Wow.
Oh my God, Metallica could do a 30-day residency, at least at that time, if Iran would allow it. Motorhead. They love that. So,
wow.
It's yeah.
Do they have? Do they allow this? So, like I know the Soviet Union used to do this. Is that they would have cover bands in lieu of having the actual artists show up? So they have Metallica cover bands or anything like that? To your knowledge?
I really doubt it.
Okay, so they're really clamping down. They don't allow anything.
Oh,
okay.
oh yeah, they're very strong. But I found myself just falling in love with the Iranian people because they kept finding ways around the rules.
Yeah.
Give you a couple quick examples. Iranian women are some of the best makeup artists in the world because they had to be covered up. The only things they could show were their hands and their faces. Mm-hmm. So you had these women, if that's all you got, that's what you do. Oh my God, they were just beautifully made up. Hot plastic surgeons did at least, and probably still do, a land office business because if the only thing you got is your face, well, there's going to be a lot of nose jobs. Or young women, young men, teenagers are not, and I was writing about teenagers, were not allowed to be out with each other in public. Maybe not, they're not supposed to be in private either, but private you could hide. But, so there are no, school dances. Well, what could be done, though, and this is one of these open secrets, is there's a lot. Iran has some beautiful terrain. And so kids would go out on hikes. And, of course, the hikes would be just the guys. And there'd be another set of hikers, just the women, just the girls. And they would meet at the top of a hill or something, or in a forest, where they could get together with each other. But they left separately. It looked like just a group of guys going on a nature hike. Just another group of girls an hour or two later on a nature hike. Perfectly wholesome, no problem. Except they would get together in secret. I love people who are that good at getting around stupid, dictatorial rules. God bless the ingenuity of the Iranian people.
Well, how did you find out this? I mean, if it's so secret.
People blogged about it. People blogged about it.
Oh, wow. So it's not that secret. It's just secret to...
It's one of these open secrets where the country... They got the religious police who generally are a terror. I think they had better things to do, or at least other things to do, or maybe I don't know. Maybe they preferred to bust people who had money so they could get bribes. I don't know. I have no fondness for the Iranian religious police. Mm-hmm. Neither do the Iranians. But also there were a lot of really good journalists covering Iran, going into it, writing about what the people did. Mm-hmm. Between the blogs and the journalists out there, I found a lot of, and God bless them both for their courage. Because Iran has no hesitation about expelling or imprisoning journalists or attacking or even killing their own people. So, yeah, I mean, look, I'm having a good laugh about this, but these people, oh my God, the bravery of the Iranian people and the journalists, Iranian and foreign, who covered that country, holy hell. I have such admiration for them.
Now, did you have any trouble with the book, or is it just like you just did the book and that's it?
I just wrote it, the publisher put it out.
Okay.
That's it. I would imagine it's not being published in Iran.
I bet. That's true.
But, yeah, Iran is one of those places. Russia is like this, too, from what I've understood. Terrific people, terrible government. Mm.
Okay. So how does it compare to the other book you did? Is there only two that you've done in the series, the South Africa one being the other?
It was just two. The South Africa book was a lot easier because it's an open society.
Right.
But one of the things that really got me about that is that it's a country in transition. I said in the introduction to the book that this is a book about teenagers, and it's a teenage country. When I wrote the book, the country itself, as we know it now, the Mandela and, the post-apartheid regime, was only about 15, 16 years old at the time. And it was going through growing pains because the majority was, of course, black. But where the money was, the whites didn't control the government anymore, but they had the money.
Yeah.
So there was still a lot of tensions. And the country had problems that every country's got problems, but incredibly high rate of AIDS, and especially, among younger people, not necessarily teenagers, but you get into your 20s. Oh, it was raging. Poverty, horrendous poverty. And yet there were also opportunities for people to move up now that apartheid was gone. And I would see the pictures of these teenagers at their proms, these black teenagers, and thinking, 5-10 years ago, you wouldn't have been dressed up going to a party. It was just, again, it was so heartening to see these kids. It's like, my God, you now have freedom. Oh God, kids, I'm so rooting for you. Make the best of it.
Did anybody talk about Rodriguez and Sugar Man?
No.
That's a whole nother story. But anyway, let's see. Are there any books that I might have missed? Those are the ones I came up with doing my quick research to find out who you were. But I knew you from Disney originally. But I wanted to get a more well-rounded portrait of who you are.
Well, I did. I've done a bunch of books based on various pop culture characters. I've written storybooks and movie adaptations based on Superman and King Kong and Batman and Fantastic Four and quite a few other things. And that's always an interesting thing because the security, the CIA should have security like Warner Brothers. Let me tell you, they are good. And I mean, what I had to do for some of these things, I could not get a script to take home. I had to read it in the office.
Wow.
And yes, in a closed room, if I wanted to go out just to the bathroom and get a drink of water, leave the script in the room. I don't blame them because secrecy on these things is very important. But for example, I was at one point supposed to write the novelization of X-Men 3.
Mm-hmm.
And I read it in the office, and I took notes, and I said, well, can I get a copy to take home? And they said, no. And I said, wait a minute. If I'm doing a storybook, something short, I can fudge over it. All I need is the main plot points and some dialogue. I'm good. But a novel has so much detail,
right,
and every detail has to be exactly right. I cannot write a novel based on one reading of the script. I have to be able to consult the script back and forth throughout the job.
Right.
And they said no, and I was off that job.
Oh wow! So then they come out. Okay.
It wasn't an argument even. It was just I have to work one way, they have to work another. Wasn't compatible. Okay, we will shake hands and say goodbye. They were all very nice about it. It's just their way of doing business flashed with mine.
Wow. Now, the ones I've seen that you've done, were they based on movie scripts or more of like animated TV episodes or things like that?
It's a mix. It's a mix.
Okay.
I've done stuff based on live-action TV, based on the Hercules TV show with Kevin Sorbo, for example. That was an original novel that I wrote based on an idea from the show Bible that said that there were people, Hercules was so famous and beloved that there were people going around the countryside pretending to be Hercules, and I thought, a Hercules impersonator. Oh yeah. Oh, that's a story. Because what if Hercules goes into a town and the Hercules impersonator was already there, drinking all the wine and sleeping with all the wenches, and then skipped town? So Hercules shows up. I'm a hero. I'm a demigod. People, I'm a good guy. I know I'm a good guy. And they said, you again. So there was that. I did Fantastic Four photo novel, which was interesting because I had to use movie stills, and because of the rules of secrecy at these movie companies, there were not a lot of stills running around. I had to be really inventive in writing, in arranging them and writing the captions. And the designer of that book, I didn't even know who it was going to be. I didn't know what he was doing until I got the book, but he did great stuff that I should have thought of. For example, there was a photo of Reed Richards and Sue Storm together. But I was writing, and I put that in at a period where I was writing about their relationship and how in the movie it tore apart because Reed was all science and no heart to speak of. Well, so I just put in the image. What the designer did is he took the image and literally, I think, ripped it in two to show the relationship tearing apart. I got it later and I said, thank you. That's what I was trying to express. You made it visually work.
Very good. Now, have you actually worked on any of the actual comic books, or just these novelizations like Fantastic Four or anything? Okay.
Pretty much the novelizations. I'd love to do the comics. And I've had some talks with people at DC, not so much Marvel, but at DC. But, well, for example, I was talking to an editor at DC who was at the time running the Batman books, sent him some story ideas. He liked some of them. He said, I'll get back to you. We'll figure out, what we might do with some of these. And then about a week or two later, he was transferred to the Superman books. And the new editor coming in wanted his own people. I don't blame him. When I was an editor, I would do that. But those story ideas are, just sitting in my computer now. So that just happens. That's business. It's a matter of it's just timing.
Right. Let's see, what else I got here? A couple other publishers. I just wrote down the names, but I don't really know what you did for them. One is Claypool Comics.
For Claypool, I was their marketing director for, oh my God, almost a decade, I guess.
Okay.
And so I would go around. I was doing everything from writing press releases to doing their conventions. The signage, the signings by the writers and artists, buying the booth at one point, arranging all the publicity for that, and that was great fun because Richard Howell, who's the editor of the line and writer and artist of some of the books, he and the publisher Ed Via, I can never remember V-I-A, how to spell. Sorry, Ed, I don't. But they basically, as long as I didn't spend much money, they basically went with what I wanted to do. And they were just terrific to work for. It was a lot of fun because for a tiny publisher, you have to figure out smarter ways to get people to pay attention because you don't have the marketing muscle of the big guys. Right. And so Richard and I would come up with things. What do we do? One example was since it's called Claypool, we created a month of books called Jump In, which were meant for new readers. You didn't have to know anything about the characters. You jump in with this issue. And Diamond got the main distributor at the time, still the main distributor, got behind it and promoted the books in their catalog, and the books sold, and we got new readers whose attitude was, hey, we didn't even know this existed. This is good stuff. It was a fine experience because I had to do everything. I mean, I was designing ads and negotiating with travel companies, trucking companies to get our booth from show to show. It was great fun. Plus, since Richard was in the comics business at DC and Marvel and is a good guy, we had people on the books: George Perez, Peter David, Kurt Busiek, just a lot of really, really top talent. And it was an absolute pleasure to. And some of those guys are still my friends today.
Did you write anything for them, or are you too busy doing the marketing and everything else?
I'm very much in magazine newspaper publishing. There's what's called the church and state division. The marketing side does not get involved with the editorial side. When I was an editor, I always appreciated marketing people who said, "Look, you make the books, we'll sell them." And that's the standpoint I took. I never even tried to submit a story because I really feel very strongly in that church and state division.
Right. But I think, isn't that actually how Peter David got started? Didn't he start?
Yes, but that was a different deal, different time, different character, different people. And there was Marvel, I don't think, had that huge problem. And also, Peter was much more interested in being a comics writer. I wanted to write comics too, but I was also doing all this other stuff. I was not creatively stifled. I was writing books. I was doing a bunch of different things. As much as I wanted to write comics, it would have felt, but it also would have put, see, here's the thing. When Peter was at Marvel, his boss was Carol Kalish, but the editor of the books that he worked for, I think his first editor was Chris Priest.
Mm-hmm.
They were two different people. The editors of the books at Claypool was my boss, Richard. So if I had said to Richard, hey, in addition to marketing, I want to do some writing, it would put him in a pretty awkward position.
Okay, I get it. Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't want to do that.
Yeah. I was in a similar situation. I worked for a number of newspapers on the sales side for years.
Right.
And if I ever wanted to do any sort of freelance writing, it never was for the newspaper I was working for, which initially baffled me, but later on I got it. But it did baffle other people. It's like, well, you work for this paper, why don't you write for it? And it's like, yeah, I came up with the same idea. I didn't say church and state, but that's a good way to describe it. So, you know.
Yeah, and one of the things, and this happened at Disney a lot, people did not understand Disney's got this huge marketing muscle. Why isn't it promoting the Disney comics? And I said, no, you don't understand. Disney has a lot of money, but it's not like one big pool of money that anybody can grab. The movie people have their marketing budget. TV people have theirs. The parks have theirs. The comics division has its, and we're a small new division. So the fact that you don't see our books in every place you look is simply because each division has to make its own profit.
Yeah.
It has its budget. So there are all these divisions and things that people think are monolithic.
Yeah. Although it would have been cool back then if you had some character in a Disney live-action feature pull out a comic book in a scene or something, or even put a little quickie plug at the beginning or the end of the movie. You know, by the way, if you like this movie, there's a comic book adaptation, you know, on arachnophobia, let's say.
Oh, yeah. Oh, believe me, we wanted that. We tried, I think.
Yeah.
Above my level, but I think there were attempts made. But, you know, I just kept my head down and made comic books.
Right.
I'll tell you one thing I did do on the marketing side of Disney that turned out very well.
Mm-hmm.
San Diego Comic-Con one year, there was going to be a Disney Comics panel at the show, which was great. That was happy. But it was going to be at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning. First thing, we thought, oh, no. These days it's a little different because the show is so completely crowded. Anything can get a good crowd. But we thought 10 a.m., that's death. People are going to be hungover. People are going to be having breakfast. People are going to be still asleep. How do we get people to show up? And I said, well, we editors were talking. And I said, well, Jesus, let's serve them breakfast or something. And what that became, when we took it to the marketing people, who were very nice, we brought in coffee and donuts. And it became our little tagline for that event. Hey, donuts with Disney. And we got a good crowd. So, yeah, I mean, you got to be careful with that church-state division, but sometimes if you got a good idea,
right,
each other.
One other publisher I was going to mention, I don't know if they, you know, it's related to any of the books we've talked about, but NBM Publishing?
Yes.
Okay.
Terry, who's the N in NBM, is a publisher. They do, he hired me to be his online marketing director. They do a lot of comics from overseas, some of them very high tone. They also did lines of erotica. They also had a sister company, Pepper Cuts, which did children's comics, which is very successful.
Okay, I know them. I've worked for them.
Yeah. And a lot of it was press releases and convention work. I wasn't in charge of marketing as much as I was at Claypool, but NBM was a good company. I was proud to be associated with them. And I wasn't there very long. I was there like, 3 years maybe. But they were a good shop, and my God, they survived in this business for more than, when I was there, one of the things I did was promote the fact the company was having its 30th anniversary. And so at the San Diego Comic-Con, I brought in a cake decorated with the initials NBM. And it's like, Terry is a brilliant survivor. Especially because, you know, a lot of the stuff from overseas, especially he got it, the Louvre Museum published or paid for, commissioned 4 graphic novels based on artwork from the Louvre. Terry did published them in America and Canada. That's a very high-tone stuff, but high-tone stuff doesn't sell very well a lot of the time. So, I mean, my hat is off to Terry for bringing a lot of really great stuff so that where Americans could see it and read it without having to get it translated. Because the translation's done. God bless him.
Let's see. I think I have three things before we go. They're all vastly different than each other.
Good.
So,
bring them on.
You're a teacher at UCLA?
I was. I
Okay.
taught around the time when Disney Comics was ending. One of the freelance gigs I scared up was I proposed to UCLA Extension, their adult education division for people, already out of college, to teach comic book writing. And I did that for 3 sessions. And it ended up benefiting me in a couple ways, which I will talk about. But the students were great. In fact, and some of the stories were good, some were not. But I loved the enthusiasm that they had. I mean, these are people. These are not college kids. These are grown-ups. They didn't have to be there, and they were, and they loved it. But I mean, in fact, 2 of the students in my first class ended up getting married to each other. So it's like, they didn't invite me to responsible for them getting together, but okay. But no, they're lovely people. But I always brought in guest lecturers for the second half of the class because I know that I don't know everything. So, and I got in people, the best ones that I could find. So there was Len Wein and Mark Wolfman, Mark Evanier, Howard Chaykin. There was I brought in James Robinson and David Goyer, and of course Goyer is writing all the Marvel movies, it seems, these days. Back then he was breaking into comics. Just Kurt Busick, Mark Waid, all these terrific comics writers and editors and some artists, because I wanted the artist's viewpoint. And a couple things that I used actually as examples to my students. At one point, Bill Morrison, who was editor-in-chief of Bongo Comics, which was doing The Simpsons, he mentioned that I was asking, well, what's going on at Bongo? He said, well, we're creating these Sunday comics pages for the foreign market. And I said, oh, really? Bill, you need any writers for these? Well, we could. Let's get in touch afterwards. And I turned to my students and I said, that's how you get work. Opportunities as soon as you can. Yep. And I ended up writing quite a few stories for Bongo. But yeah, UCLA Extension, it was, oh boy, I loved writing that class because it's true. You learn, once you have to really break down what you think you know into things so that other people can understand it, it really teaches you how to see what is in a story rather than just what feels right. To really understand the mechanics and the techniques and what's important and what's not. And also having been on stage, having done stand-up and other comedy, it allowed me to ham it up here and there. I had fun. And the students, as I say, were really good. So that's UCLA.
So
I can tell you,
this leads into probably the next thing, because you talked about performing. It says you did some improv with Second City?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Second City Hollywood.
Okay.
Technically the Second City Hollywood Training Center, because the only real Second City is the one in New York. Chicago.
Chicago,
sorry.
Yeah.
But, yeah. And I did improv there and at other places, Improv Olympic and the Groundlings and other places for about a decade. And it was so much fun. And I ended up running into people who became sizable names, and it's weird as hell. My favorite example, Lisa Kudrow, who went on to do Friends and many other things. It became quite this big deal. Before she was Phoebe on Friends, we were students in this one class. I didn't get to know her well. It was a drop-in class, and so sometimes she was there, sometimes I was. But it was weird because Lisa, it was always good. Good actress, funny as hell. There was no question. Nobody knew she was going to be, one of the stars of one of the biggest sitcoms ever. But everybody there could see, oh yeah, she's talented. She's going to have a career.
Yeah.
And she works hard and all that. always thought Lisa was pretty, a real knockout. There's no question, very attractive woman.
Mm-hmm.
I never expected to see her like on the cover of Glamour or all these big fancy beauty and fashion magazines. It's like she's a pretty woman, but there are a lot of pretty women.
Yeah.
And so suddenly there was what fame can do to somebody who is deserving of it, but it takes you places where you wouldn't expect them to go.
Right.
And again, yes, I always thought Lisa was very pretty, but sharing cover space on places like Glamour.
Yeah.
Wow, good for you, Lisa. Knock 'em dead. She was great. She was very nice and talented and funny. She deserves all the success she's got.
And then the last thing, but I might talk a little bit more about something else, but your wife is Leah Hernandez, and she
story, yes.
And you told me she works on Teen Titans Go.
She is one of the artists. She has been one of the artists on the Teen Titans Go comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And she also has done graphic novels of her own. She worked with Gail Simone on a graphic novel called Killer Princesses. She has done her own books, and she continues to work on her own projects now. And she's done a lot of stuff in addition to comics. But yeah, she does. The main thing she's known for these days is drawing stories for Teen Titans Go comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And we have met some of the people who work on the show, and a couple of them have written stories that she's drawn, like Amy Wolfram and Merrill Hagen. And it was such a joy that Merrill Hagen has written for Teen Titans Go. He's on staff. He knows what he's doing. He's really good. And he has asked for Leah to draw his stories. It's like when you've got somebody who knows the show inside, outside, upside down, and he says, I want her. It's like, yeah, that's my wife, the talented one, who works her butt off, get it on model, and make it funny, and tell the story. Let me put it this way. If you had started out by asking about me, I would never have gotten to myself. I think she's the best.
And I do see her books in the Barnes & Noble section in the children's section. So that's right. It's not in the graphic novels. It's not in the humor. It's like, so there we go.
She's terrific. You give her a podcast hour. She has many wonderful stories. Let me put it that way.
I'll have to talk to her in a future podcast and get the real dirt on you. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I guess that's about it. I wanted to say just like, you mentioned Bongo Comics. I didn't mention that, but you just wrote basic scripts. Was it for any particular title or just the Simpsons title, or did you do anything like Radioactive Man or something crazy like that?
No, mostly because I went where the greatest need was, and the Simpsons and comics and the Bart Simpson title, those were where they needed stories, so that's where I submitted.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, those are the people at Bongo treat you very well. I mean, they're very, very good folks.
Yes.
But the characters, and I didn't realize this until I started writing them, you can't go wrong. As long as you keep them in character, they'll be funny. You don't have to invent much. I did a story once and all it was Homer had to repair a hole in the roof.
Mm-hmm.
And it flowed. It's like once you could throw them into the simplest situations and they work. It's not like I'm the world's greatest comedy writer, although I like to think I'm good. But these characters work so well, solo or in connection with each other. As long as you keep them true to themselves, keep them in character, they're going to be funny. You don't have to contrive anything. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that seems a prevailing thing. I've talked to Ian Boothby before, Terry Delagine, and Bill Morrison's a friend of mine. So yeah. They all say the same thing. So
Ian Boothby is so funny. Oh my God.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I first encountered him because he wrote a Casper TV movie, and I was doing Harvey stuff, of course, and so and then later he started doing the Bongo stuff, and I kept asking him, how do you get into this Bongo thing? Of course, now the time has passed, but he says, just keep writing, they'll eventually publish you. So
that's it. I just kept submitting ideas,
yeah.
And they said, oh yeah, that one's good. Go do that one.
Yeah. All right, at this point, we've talked for a decent amount of time, so thank you very much. Do you have anything to plug that you're currently working on, or a website, or anything else?
Not at the moment. Right now, I'm not. I have a full-time job, so I'm not freelancing, so I don't have that much to plug. I'm trying to think. The latest thing I have is a few years ago, so I will mention it, but no, I don't. But if you don't want to put it on the air, don't worry about it. I wrote a book of, and this is one of the few things that was not an assignment that I came up with on my own. A guidebook for teenage atheists and agnostics called "What If I'm an Atheist?"
Wow.
And I write whatever I can write, and that one was that came out 3 years ago, something like that. And it was because it was my own idea. It is one that is very, and because it's the most recent, it's very dear to me, and because it wasn't an assignment, not an assignment, not a complete buyout. If it sells, I get royalties. But yeah, I'm very proud of that book. I worked my butt off on it, and I think it actually does a service, because some atheist and agnostic kids out there are really all alone out there. So having a book like this one, and there are not many like it, books aimed at that audience, I felt, oh, good, maybe I'm going to, not only as I think this is a good thing to write about, but maybe it'll actually help somebody. I love that idea.
So most of the books you've written, they're still in print, and you can get them on Amazon or in bookstores?
No.
Oh,
I don't know, because I'm not buying them.
Oh, okay.
Yes, they are available on Amazon, but they might be, because, there are a lot of booksellers on Amazon.
Right.
But you might not get it directly from Amazon. You might get it from any number of the stores that Amazon partners with.
Right.
But yeah, the book, I think pretty much everything I've written is still out there from one source or another.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, I really appreciate you being on the podcast with me today.
My pleasure. This is fun.
All right. I thank you very much, and I'll let you know when it airs.
Very good. Then I can be embarrassed. It'll be fun.
Yes. All right. It'll be sometime in December probably, but I'm probably going to cut this part off. But anyway, so.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, and have a good day. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening, and thank you again, David Seidman, for being my special guest. Episode number 17 will be coming soon. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. You can become a patron of Fun Ideas Productions, and if everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help for me to put on these podcasts. This has been the Fun Ideas Podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2018 Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you very much, and have a good night.